Triumphal Hymn of the Nobility, Chapter 11, First Part. No way in hell, the boy refused flatly, though his voice quavered. I hate nobles, but I hate wannabe nobles even more. I'm outta here. As he kicked off the floor like a scared rabbit, there was a streak of light behind him. However, by that point Pick's feet were pounding the floor a good 15 feet away. Flame shot up around the boy's feet. What the? He stammered, leaping away. But the next spot around Pick's feet also burst into flames. Now the boy had fallen flat on his ass, and Baridon waggled a longsword that looked to measure more than 6.5 feet at him, saying, "This is my magic sword, Flame Soldier. It's covered with human blood that I can fling around, turning it into a blade 1,000 degrees hot, enough to melt iron or slay my foes. Better still, it's got a range of over 30 feet. Nobody's ever outrun it. Okay, kid, you'd better throw in the towel and offer me that little pink neck of yours." "I ain't offering you squat. My blood's primo stuff, better than any wine you're likely to find. If I was gonna let anyone drink it, it'd be my buddy and nobody else." "Your buddy? Who's that?" "His name's D," Pick replied, "and he's 1,000,000 times better than you." "Precisely." Baridon heard the Countess's voice above him. The beautiful woman who'd been clinging to the ceiling had already dropped to within 6 feet of him, the dagger in her right hand just waiting to flash into action. Not even unholy speed could prevent that. However, perhaps another power made the impossible possible. The blade in the former hunter's hands, Flame Soldier, shot up, its tip running through the Countess's solar plexus and exiting her back, at which point devilish flames of lotus red spread across her dress. "Ma'am?" Racing over to where the noblewoman had fallen covered in blood and flames, the boy pried the dagger from her grasp and stood ready with it. Hefting the Countess onto his back, like a man possessed, Pick backed away. As Baridon watched the drama coolly, tension shot into his face. Pick saw it too. Baridon's eyes were locked on something to the rear. Could it be D? Pick whipped around to see and found a figure coming from off in the distance. The boy's ballooning expectations quickly deflated. The figure had a pair of swords on his back, and the evil aura that gusted from him was unquestionably that of a noble. "Ah!" One of the 4 retainers Lord Gillian mentioned. "Zeno Braylo, is it? I understand ever since you got the kiss from Lord Gillian, you've wielded a pair of swords no one can break or parry. Now we're on the same side, but even though Lord Gillian's nixed any scuffles, I simply can't resist this." Baridon had the face of a beautiful maiden, but it became that of a ghastly lord of war. As he raised the enchanted sword he held, a spark of hope ignited in Pick's heart. If the vampires fought among themselves, it would give him an opening to escape. However, as Braylo approached, he said, "I know not who you are, but that child's blood will be mine. Or not mine, so much as blue soldiers and gray soldiers." "That's too bad," said the former hunter. "So, I have a rival now. That only makes my hunger all the stronger. You can have my scraps." Two pairs of eyes gave off a reddish glow as they fell on Pick. First, I'm going to cut both your legs off so you can't run away. This might hurt a little, but try to be a man about it, Barry Don said, adjusting his grip on his longsword. A harsh sound rang in Pick's ears. Braylow's two swords once again sought blood. Cut off his legs, Braylow said in a vacant tone. I shall take his arms off. Sounds good, Barry Don said, slowly starting toward Pick. It was unclear whether it was Blue Soldier or Gray Soldier that Braylow drew. Flee, said the thin voice that crept into the ear of the almost completely despairing Pick. Ma'am, you're okay. Flee, the Countess repeated, quickly. In that instant, the weakness and doubt eating away at the boy's heart were utterly dispelled. I can't run when a lady puts it to me like that. Then you shall die for nothing. That ain't true. I'll protect you, ma'am. It's just... well, if I don't pull it off, I'm sorry. Pick gripped the dagger. He was no longer afraid. To defend a noble woman, he would do battle with a true noble and an imitation. Though it was a somewhat odd sensation, the boy thought to himself, sure, why not? Just then a hard sound began to ring out sharply. Braylow's enchanted swords had descended into madness. At the same time, Barry Don spun around. A black form was bearing down on them from the same direction Pick and Braylow had come from. But how exquisite he was. The wide-brimmed traveler's hat, the jet-black coat, and the long sword on his back all seemed faintly blurry, no doubt because even the lights were bashful around him. A symphony sprang back to life in Pick's head. There was a fanfare that resounded at the dramatic climax. Yes, that was what truly suited this young man. Even the two demonic swordmen had to admit it. Such beauty. It seemed enough to make the fighting spirit of even men such as these melt like lead. This man was entitled to be greeted with symphonies performed by the dead. D, said Zeno Braylow. This is D, Barry Don groaned. Yes, this was D. Not even glancing at Pick or the Countess, the hunter walked over without fear of the two fiends, an icy sculpture of unearthly beauty. However, his left hand was missing, and his complexion was as pale as paraffin. Would D be able to withstand the two unholy swordsmen when they cut loose with their magic swords? I'll take the child, D told them in a low voice, a sword gleaming in his hand. That was the call to battle. Kicking off the floor as if he were gliding, Barry Don swiped at the hunter. The blow came from directly overhead, and D's blade shot up to parry it. No, it was actually an attack. Barry Don's body reeled wildly back, and with it the sword that had been deflected, while the deadly thrust aimed at the former hunter's throat made fresh blood spray from him like a mist. However, the foe of the lovely female face didn't stop, didn't decay, but rather he jumped back a good 10 feet to escape the vampire hunter. D's thrust probably hadn't been very deep, due to the blood he'd lost along with his left hand. Making no attempt to pursue Barry Don, D turned around. The magic swords of his second foe were no longer rattling together. Holding one blade in each hand, Braylo was slowly raising them high. In his right hand, Blue Soldier had its blade slanting to the right, while Gray Soldier in his left dipped it to the left side. D closed a dozen feet between them in a single stride. One blade came down from overhead, intending to cleave him, the other sweeping from the left side in less than the blink of an eye, and both were stopped in the form of an X. Pushing away, D changed his footing. His blade shifted to a forward position, aimed straight at his opponent, but the hunter's stance crumbled. The world had seemed to turn upside down. Along with him, Braylo's blade leaned to the right, and then to the left, and once again the world spun, and D dropped to one knee. It was a second later that his back burst into flames. "Take that, Hunter," Barry Don exclaimed. "But as a favor from someone who used to be in the same line of work, I'll finish you with my blade." Flame Soldier had sprayed D with the blood that could even melt iron, and now the blade was being brought down on D's head with all Barry Don's might. And though the hunter should have dodged, his body was being held in place by the crossed magic swords. In a second that would determine life or death, Barry Don swung his enchanted blade to the right. Though the golden dagger Pick had thrown was struck down with disappointing ease. This gave D enough time to hurl his blade, for Braylo's concentration had also been broken. Whistling as it arced through the air, the stark blade was parried by the pair of crossed swords, but the hunter's steel pushed through the scissoring blades to behead Braylo spectacularly. Off to the left, Barry Don had already leapt into the air. D twisted around. A sword was bearing down on him from overhead. It was too late to dodge or to parry. Black Cloth ripped. An anguished cry went up. The former hunter landed again, his blade in the same position from the blow he'd executed. It was not the swung blade that D was beneath, but rather the arms that gripped it. Making a sound like he was going to vomit, Barry Don tumbled forward, and in return D got to his feet. After adjusting the split brim of his traveler's hat, D glanced over at Barry Don. From his foe's back, in a spot directly behind the heart, there jetted a wooden needle. Narrowly evading Flame Soldier as it came slicing down at him, D had thrust a rough wooden needle through his foe's heart. The cry of pain had been Barry Don's. But how? D hadn't been holding a needle. Both ends of the wooden needle had been honed, and one end of it stuck in the stump of the hunter's left arm, transforming it into a deadly weapon. "That was awesome, D. Just awesome. I really respect you. I swear someday I'll be a hunter just like you," the boy exclaimed, his body trembling with excitement and intense emotion. Looking down at Braylo's headless corpse, he said, "But this guy had a really great parry. Looks like it was no match for your power after all. Serves the bastard right." Saying nothing, D went over to Braylo and opened the front of the nobleman's jacket with the tip of his sword. The right side of his chest was horribly caved in. "So he was wounded," said the boy. "That's why he wanted blood so bad. But this is really something. Half his chest is busted in. It must have been that guy." "What guy?" Pick hurriedly told D all about the failure they'd encountered in the engine room, Dee didn't say anything, and after hearing all that the boy had to say, he turned his gaze to Countess Genevieve, who was down on the floor staring up at him. Pick spread his arms wide to protect her. No, you can't kill this lady. She helped me and the little lady a bunch of times. Hell, she even helped your left hand. And where is it? Damned if I know. It was with the little lady, but they weren't where we were supposed to meet up. There was blood all over the place, and the lady here said it was the left hand's. Where is the Grand Duke? Dee asked the Countess. The laboratory, and I won't tell you where it is. He's important to me, after all. Dee's eyes gave off an eerie glow, and the Countess's expression changed. Here was a young man so fierce he'd lop off her breasts, or split her mouth from ear to ear, if that's what it took to loosen her tongue. However, the terrible light left his eyes all too easily. Perhaps he'd recalled the sight of her laying flowers at the graves. As Dee began to walk quietly away, Pick said, "Wait, I'm going with you." Dee didn't even look back. Ever since they'd parted company in the desert, he and the boy had been complete strangers. When the hunter had advanced about 50 yards, a red Delta Wing aircraft appeared from the corridor on the left. On spotting Dee, it halted about 20 feet off the floor. Protruding from the center of the flying machine was the stocky upper body of a middle-aged man. "Now this is a surprise," said the plump man, his eyes going wide. "Who knew any man in the world could be so handsome? I'm afraid just looking at you is making me funny in the head. You're Dee, aren't you? I heard about you from Lord Gillian. They call me the Confessor. Originally, the mayor of Krishkin hired me to guard his daughter, but then Lord Gillian gave me the kiss, so now I'm in his service. I'm due to meet up with Lord Gillian soon, and now I'll have a nice souvenir for him. Your head." Dee's right hand whipped out. Halfway through the arc it limned, a silvery flash zipped against the side of the flying machine, rebounding with a melodic sound. What then embedded itself in the floor was a steel bolt. "It's no use," said the Confessor. "This craft may be light, but it's made of one of the nobility's supreme alloys. For all your might, not even you can break it. Now answer my question." The jeering laughter the pudgy man unleashed from up high halted unexpectedly. Although the Confessor nervously twisted around to scan in every direction, his gaze soon returned to Dee. But the shadow clinging to his face hadn't been wiped away completely. As if to erase it, he began his bizarre confession, saying, "My name is Dee. My parents were..." Groaning, the hunter's airborne foe clutched his chest. Was this due to the strength of Dee's psyche? Or had some defensive system guarding his past been activated? "This is just..." The Confessor's eyes bugged, and his mouth spat up blood. It can't be. How could this?" The eyes that peered down at Dee spoke of horror and astonishment that pushed the man to the brink of lunacy. Listen well, humans and nobles. I'm Dee, and my parents are..." Perhaps it was coincidence that the long blade was put against the man's throat. A slight pull to the right, and the Confessor's throat split open, spraying blood wildly. At the same time, the flying machine tilted, and all too quickly crashed against the floor. As the Confessor stained the pilot seat with his blood, Dee walked over to him. It was the scythe. Benelli's great scythe. Benelli means Grim Reaper. Said he'd just keep coming. Judging from his dazed monologue, the confessor must have really been terrified. He'd probably located that flying machine just to escape the fearsome scythe that was coming for him. But the accursed weapon had been riding on the man's back. Behind D, Pick called out his name. The boy had followed after the hunter, shooting a quick glance that way and confirming that the Countess was with him. D said to the confessor, "If you don't want to die, tell me that noble woman's secret. I'll bring you right to the examination room for treatment." The confessor raised his face. "Help me, please," he said. "Where is this so-called laboratory?" Harsh fate was bearing down on Zeno Goshen with the usual stealthy footsteps. After the battle in which they'd lost Benelli, he'd followed Pick and the others, but he'd lost sight of them. When they'd stopped the train and boarded, Jillian had ordered everyone to split up. Knowing the legend of the Iron Castle, he intended to speak with Grand Duke Drago and make an ally of him, so that he might use the Grand Duke in his search for Annette. And what a coincidence. The girl was actually on the train. When Goshen lost sight of her, he should have sought out Jillian to inform him of such, but he realized his signal whistle would be of no use here. The layout of the train was so vast and complicated, the sound would be twisted, reflected, and ultimately absorbed. They were all just children lost in a deep jungle. Still not knowing how to call up the schematics, Goshen wandered through the train, walking in silence down corridors so spacious they seemed like halls. And up ahead he saw that man. He was right in the midst of battle. Nearly 10 mechanical people surrounded the naked man, some of them blasting him with flames, some hammering him repeatedly with their iron fists, and still others slashing at him with lengthy blades. It looked more like a slaughter than a fight. However, before Goshen's eyes, one mechanical person after another was destroyed. The man's body seemed capable of rendering all their attacks ineffectual. Muscles and organs smashed, shot and rent, closed and regenerated in an instant. Goshen himself witnessed an eyeball that had been shot out swiftly, returning to its original state. The man used change with blocks of stones attached as his weapons, but those primitive arms truly demonstrated devilish power. He swung them around. That alone left the mechanical people exploding or belching flames. In less than a minute the man had reduced them all to twisted scrap metal. After the last of them was destroyed, the man began walking in the same direction Goshen was headed. Instinctively, Goshen tailed him. The nobleman got the feeling something decisive awaited them. After he'd advanced more than 100 yards, the man swung his right arm to the rear. So great was the speed that even a noble among nobles like Goshen wasn't able to get completely out of the way. The iron chain and block of stone that flew at the nobleman with supersonic speed took off the right half of his face. Goshen immediately played dead, though the nobleman knew he'd be finished if his foe dealt at him a coup de grace. The man just kept on walking. Goshen, of course, started following him once again. After they'd walked another 3/4 of a mile, the door to another car appeared. The man vanished just in front of it. And the way he disappeared, it was as if he'd been swallowed up by another dimension. And by the time Goshen had confirmed that the nearby door, walls, and floor contained no hidden passageway, he was ready to drop from pain and despair. Someone called out his name. Actually, the nobleman recognized the pair of figures headed his way. Lord Gillian and Reston. The noble who'd lured out Baradon and his compatriots, and turned them into vampires, calmly walked over to Gorshin and asked him what had happened. Once Gorshin had told him everything, Gillian's whole face twisted with delight, and he said, "So, Dee, the Christian girl and the Grand Duke are all here. Excellent. I shall rid us all of the lot of them." The trio went over to the door where the naked man had vanished. Gillian seemed to stroke the space lovingly. After doing so for about a minute, he returned to his normal demeanor. Seeing that sweat was forming on the brow of this noble among nobles, Gorshin was shocked. Tremendous mental powers were being called into play. "We may enter. I'm going in." As Gillian pressed forward, first the end of his right foot vanished, followed by his leg, his torso, and then his face. "Next, you may pass, Quake," Gillian's voice said from an area of empty space. It had to have come from the naked man's vanishing point. The rotund man was also swallowed up by thin air. Gorshin stepped forward, staggering all the while, but at that very moment a gleam of light shot from the empty space, to pierce his heart. Knocked back by the force of the impact, he fell to the floor with an iron stake sticking out of his chest. "But why, Lord Gillian?" His stunned query drew a reply from the empty space. "The man you are following is a being on the level of the Grand Duke or myself. The reason your face hasn't returned to normal after all of this time, purebred noble that you are, is because he did that to you. Against a man such as that, you would be no more than a hindrance. Rest well. Someday we shall meet again in the next world." A split second before Gorshin returned to dust, the retinas of his decaying eyes were emblazoned with the grinning face of Zeno Gillian poking out of empty space. First part, end.